In the year 907 AD, the sun that had once illuminated the entire East Asian world, the great Tang Empire, crashed from the sky. This was not merely the end of a dynasty, it was the total collapse of China's Second Imperial Age. As the fires raged in the capital city of Chang'an, Chinese history plunged into a terrifying abyss, known to later historians as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. For the next 53 years, the central plains of China would become a colossal gladiatorial arena. This was an absurd era where the throne belonged to whoever had the strongest army. The crown was no longer sacred, it was a poker chip passed around the warlord's gambling table. The Liang, Tang, Jin, Han, and Zhou, 5 short-lived dynasties flickered by, one after another, like scenes in a frantic montage. In just half a century, the throne changed hands between 8 different families and 13 emperors. On average, a bloody dynastic change occurred every 4 years. In this age, the arrogance of generals reached its zenith in Chinese history, while the dignity of scholars was trampled into the dust. Law was void, morality had vanished, and the social fabric had dissolved. For that blood-soaked throne, fathers and sons murdered each other, brothers turned on one another, and ministers assassinated their lords. And beyond the carnage in the court, the countryside was a wasteland of bleached bones, stretching for 1,000 miles. The once prosperous Yellow River Basin became a purgatory of endless warfare. With supplies scarce, armies even turned captured civilians into dried human jerky to feed their troops. In this era, a human life was worth less than a blade of grass. This was one of the darkest fractures in Chinese history. The old order was shattered, and a new one had yet to be born. And it was in this moment of chaos and weakness that, on the northern horizon, a powerful nomadic cavalry was massing. Their greedy eyes had already crossed the Great Wall, fixated on a strategic choke point that would determine the fate of China for the next 400 years. The 16 prefectures of Yan and Yun.
Hello and welcome back to China Puzzle. I'm ZYQ. With the recent international success of the Chinese game Where Wens Meet, many of you have asked us to do an episode on its historical background. And while we consider ourselves a serious history channel, we looked into the game for our fans and found something fascinating. The developers have cleverly avoided popular settings like the 3 Kingdoms or the Warring States, and instead have chosen a brilliant, specific moment in time, 962 AD. This is the very beginning of the Song dynasty, but the game's true backdrop begins even earlier, in this chaotic 5 dynasties period. This is an era that is not well known, even to many Chinese people, let alone international players. So, we've decided to take a brief detour from our Qin and Han narrative. In this 2-part special, we will explore this infamous period of Chinese history, a story of collapse and rebirth.
Let us turn our gaze away from the glorious 1,000-year-old capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang and look to the northern edge of the Chinese Empire. We will find a geopolitical shift far more profound than any dynastic change taking place. For the past millennium, from the first emperor of Qin to the golden age of the Tang, the number one enemy of the Chinese Empire had always come from the northwest. That was the direction from which the Zhongdu, the Turks, and the Tibetans came howling. To defend against the cold winds from the northwestern steppes, dynasty after dynasty had fortified the Great Wall and stationed their most elite legions along the Hexi Corridor and the Yin Mountains. However, with the collapse of the Tang Empire, the compass of history took a dramatic, terrifying turn. The northwestern threat gradually faded with changes in climate and the decline of the Silk Road. But the northeast, that frozen land between the White Mountains and the Black River, was brewing a destructive force unlike any before. From this point on, until the Qing conquest 1,000 years later, China's greatest existential threat would be permanently locked in the northeast. The seeds of this disaster were sown in the late Tang. To suppress the northeastern Khitan and Shi tribes, the court established the powerful Fanyang Military Command. This was a massive border army of several 100,000 elite troops. It was meant to be the empire's watchdog in the northeast. But the Anlushan rebellion turned this watchdog into a wolf that devoured its master. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed, the central authority of the Tang disintegrated. The three garrisons of Hebei became, in effect, independent kingdoms. To preserve their own strength, these warlords not only stopped attacking the northern nomads, but began to trade with them, even hiring their cavalry as mercenaries for their own civil wars. And while the warlords of the Central Plains were busy fighting each other, the power vacuum beyond the Great Wall was filled by a man named Yelu Abaoji. In 907 AD, the very same year that the Tang dynasty was usurped, Yelu Abaoji united the 8 Khitan tribes. He built an altar, made sacrifices to heaven, and declared himself the great Khan of all Khitans, the true king in the north. From that moment, the situation in China's northeast was fundamentally altered. Unlike the raiders of the past, Yelu Abaoji was building a true kingdom. They had a written script, fortified cities, and even a bureaucracy modeled on the Chinese system. This was a finely tuned war machine, and it stared coldly at the fractured, glittering world to the south, waiting for the right moment to break down the door. And that door was the 16 prefectures of Yan and Yun. We need to take a moment to truly look at this land. This was not a desolate frontier like the northwest of the Qin and Han. Since the dawn of Chinese civilization, this had been core Han territory. It was a densely populated agricultural region, with prosperous cities like Yuzhou, modern-day Beijing. The people here spoke Chinese, wrote in Chinese characters, and worshipped their Chinese ancestors. But more importantly, it was a suit of natural armor, gifted by God to the agrarian civilization of the Central Plains. These 16 prefectures precisely covered the most treacherous terrain of the Yan and Taihang mountain ranges. Look at this map. The 9 prefectures beyond the mountains, located on the high ground, were not just a defensive outpost. They were one of China's most important sources of war horses. Control of this area gave the central dynasties the strategic resource to build large cavalry corps and compete with the nomads on mobility. The 7 prefectures before the mountains guarded the key mountain passes, the gates through the mountains. These 7 prefectures were 7 iron locks on those gates. As long as these passes were in Han hands, the northern cavalry could only gaze at the towering peaks and sigh. Their horses could not fly over the Great Wall. Their supply lines could not survive the treacherous mountain roads. The Yanyun region was the shield of the Central Plains. But in the 5 Dynasties period, that shield began to crack. The sky in the north grew darker. The beacon towers on the Yan mountains still burned, but the eyes of the watchmen were filled with fear. The great gambling game in the Central Plains was growing more frantic. Every change of dynasty consumed vast numbers of elite troops. The garrisons defending Yanyun were continuously drained, their soldiers sent south to fill the bottomless pit of the war for the throne.
And south of the mountains, a Shadow Turk warlord named Shi Jingtang was besieged in the city of Taiyuan. In his eyes, there was no country, no people, only a desperate lust for power and the terror of his own death. The decision he was about to make would shatter the destiny of the continent and plunge Chinese history into a 400-year nightmare of being defenseless.
First, a brief introduction to this pack of wolves from the west, the Shadow Turks. If you look at the imperial family trees of the 5 dynasties, you will discover a shocking fact. 3 of the dynasties that ruled the Central Plains, the later Tang, later Jin, and later Han, were founded not by Han Chinese, but by comrades in arms from the same military group. They were a tribe of Western Turks known as the Shatuo. In the chaos of the late Tang, this mercenary legion, known as the Foxes of the Desert, became the empire's last resort, thanks to their unparalleled skill in mounted archery. From the one-eyed dragon Li Keong to his successors, the Shatuo military aristocracy effectively controlled the fate of the late Tang military. This was a wolf pack that revered strength above all. In their circle, there was no eternal loyalty, only eternal interest. Adopted sons killed their fathers. Subordinates murdered their commanders. Whoever had the biggest fist was the son of heaven. And in 936 AD, the Shatuo warlord Shi Jingtang was about to live by that principle. At this moment, he was the military governor of Hedong, in command of the most elite Shatuo cavalry. But he was in a fatal trap. The current emperor was his own brother-in-law and also his mortal enemy. The emperor, deeply suspicious, was attempting to strip him of his military power and transfer him to a post in the interior. In the 5 dynasties, losing your army meant losing your life. Shi Jingtang chose to rebel. The emperor quickly mobilized the entire state's army and laid siege to his city. Inside the walls, supplies were dwindling. Outside, hundreds of thousands of crack imperial troops were closing in. Shi Jingtang stood on the battlements, watching his crumbling defenses. He knew that on his own, his destruction was only a matter of time. To be, or not to be? In the depths of his despair, his strategist offered him a piece of advice that would be cursed by every historian for the next 1,000 years. Look north. Ask the Khitans for help. This was no ordinary plea for aid. The Khitans had already founded the great Liao dynasty. Their Khan was now an emperor. Their new ruler, Yelu Deguang, was ambitious and already coveted the central plains. To get him to fight the powerful later Tang army, the price would be astronomical. To survive, Shi Jingtang sent a secret envoy north with a contract. In it, he offered 3 conditions. First, cede territory. The 16 prefectures of Yanyun, that priceless strategic high ground, would be permanently given to the Khitans. Second, pay tribute. An annual payment of 300,000 bolts of silk. And third, the most infamous of all, call him father. The 45-year-old Shi Jingtang, in his official state letter, addressed the 34-year-old Yelu Deguang as Father Emperor and referred to himself as the Son Emperor. This was not just a diplomatic submission, it was an ethical suicide. In Confucian culture, the relationship between ruler and father was the bedrock of morality. For a Chinese emperor to call a barbarian chieftain father signified a complete bankruptcy of political legitimacy. But Shi Jingtang didn't care. He wanted the Khitan Iron Cavalry. The deal was struck. Yelu Deguang personally led 50,000 horsemen south. They smashed into the flank of the later Tang army. The exhausted infantry collapsed under the fresh assault. It was a surreal scene. Shi Jingtang opened his city gates and knelt before the horse of a man 11 years his junior, shouting, "Long live the emperor!" Yelu Deguang, beaming, took off his own imperial robes and personally dressed Shi Jingtang in them, crowning him the emperor of the Great Jin. The allied forces then marched south. The later Tang fell. The old emperor and his entire family committed suicide by fire. Shi Jingtang, walking over the corpses of his relatives, finally sat on the throne he had dreamed of. But the price was the future of his entire nation. In 938 AD, the official order to hand over the territory was issued. Yu, Ji, Ying, Mo, Zhuo, Tan, Shun, Xin, Gui, Ru, Wu, Yun, Ying, Huan, Shuo, Wei. 16 names, each one a fortress, a fertile plain, and a home to millions of Han Chinese people. For them, it was the apocalypse. Yesterday, they were subjects of a Chinese dynasty. Today, they were sold like cattle to the barbarians by their own emperor. More fatally, with the transfer of these 16 prefectures, the great door that had protected the agrarian civilization for a millennium was torn from its hinges. From Yanyun to the banks of the Yellow River, the land was now a flat, open plain. The capital cities of Luoyang and Kaifeng were left completely exposed. The Khitan cavalry could now ride unopposed, watering their horses in Yuzhou in the morning and at the Yellow River by evening. The heart of the Central Plains was now permanently at the mercy of the enemy's blade.
Though in fairness, Shi Jingtang's governance was far superior to his contemporaries, his 2 great crimes, ceding the 16 prefectures and calling the Khitan emperor father, would forever seal his reputation. For over 1,000 years, the Son Emperor became his only name. He died in humiliation and infamy, and just a few years after his death, the false peace he had bought with his dignity would also come to an end.
In 942 AD, the Son Emperor Shi Jingtang died in a state of shame and terror. He was succeeded by his nephew, Shi Chongui. The new emperor seemed to have a bit more of a spine. While he was willing to call the northern emperor grandfather, he refused to call himself a subject. This pathetic shred of dignity came from a shift in the balance of power. The central dynasty had gradually rebuilt an army capable of challenging the Liao. But the young, rash emperor gave the Liao ruler Yelu Deguang the perfect excuse to go to war. The Liao emperor was no longer content with just the 16 prefectures. He wanted the entire glittering world of the Central Plains. From 944 AD, the Liao launched 3 consecutive invasions. The first time, they were repelled. The second time, a surprise Jin cavalry charge during a great wind forced Yelu Deguang to flee in humiliation on a lone camel. But without the 16 prefectures, any victory was temporary. The defeated Liao could retreat to the northeast to recover. The victorious Jin could not pursue them past the mountains. They could only wait, in their lonely border cities on the plains, for the northern wolf pack to emerge once more. In 946 AD, the year our game's protagonist is born, Yelu Deguang laid a cunning trap. He had a Han Chinese general in his service feign a surrender, luring the Jin army north. The naive young emperor Shi Chongui fell for it, entrusting his entire elite army to his uncle-in-law, Du Chongwei. What followed was one of the most infuriating episodes in this entire period. Du Chongwei, a man with little military experience, marched the army north. Just as he was about to take a key city, he was ambushed by Yelu Deguang's main force. Du Chongwei ordered a retreat, but he could not shake the Liao cavalry. He was finally surrounded on the banks of the Hutuo River. In this desperate moment, a vanguard general named Wang Qing volunteered to seize the floating bridge over the river, the Zhongdu Bridge, to open an escape route. Du Chongwei agreed and gave him 2,000 men. And yet Wang Qing performed a miracle. With suicidal courage, his 2,000 men charged and captured the bridge. Then the Liao counterattacked. Facing a Khitan force many times his size, Wang Qing did not retreat. He ordered his men to form a line with their backs to the river, preparing for a fight to the death. But he was not seeking death. He was waiting for hope. On the south bank of the river was the main Jin army. If Du Chongwei would just send reinforcements or even make a feint, Wang Qing's force might survive. They might even win. Wang Qing sent messenger after messenger begging for help. Each time, the only response from the south bank was a dead silence. What was Du Chongwei doing? He was calculating. Just like Xu Jingtang before him, this supreme commander of the Jin army was playing his own game. He looked at the surrounded Wang Qing as a disposable pawn. He was not thinking about how to defeat the Khitans. He was thinking about how, like his in-law Xu Jingtang, he could sell out his country in exchange for his own power and glory. The histories say the battle that day was horrific. Wang Qing fought at the front, leading his men from sunrise to sunset. No reinforcements, no supplies, no hope. As the last rays of the sun disappeared, the 53-year-old Wang Qing fell on the land he had sworn to protect. His blood soaked into the soil of the Yanyun region. It was the last drop of defiance from a dying land. Wang Qing's death was not just the fall of a hero, it was the final shattering of the empire's spine. Shortly after his death, Du Chongwei, who had sat idly by, made his move. In response to a surrender offer from Yelu Deguang, Du Chongwei, the commander of 100,000 elite troops, ordered his entire army to lay down their weapons. This was the infamous Betrayal at Zhongdu Bridge. An army of 100,000, the last shield of the Central Plains, surrendered without firing a single arrow. When the Jin soldiers were ordered to take off their armor and put on the Khitan-issued barbarian robes, countless hardened veterans wept openly. In that moment, the backbone of the Central Plains was completely broken. The road to the capital city of Kaifeng was now wide open. The Khitans didn't even need to fight, they just had to ride. In the first month of 947 AD, in the dead of winter, Yelu Deguang strolled into the city of Kaifeng. The Jin Emperor Shi Chongui and his family were taken captive and exiled to the frozen north to begin a life of living death. The old dynasty was dead. A new order had not yet been born.
But it is on these ruins, beside the bones of fallen heroes like General Wang Qing, that a new power begins to stir. Since the meat-eaters in the High Court have chosen betrayal, the duty of protecting this land must now fall to the shoulders of the common folk in the Jianghu, the world of martial artists and vagabonds. The so-called Xia, or knights errant, are born from the desperation and defiance of this darkest hour. They may not be from the high martial clans, but they are from the common soil. They are born of the Han.
Yelu Deguang may have ridden into Kaifeng on a warhorse, but he quickly discovered that conquering an empire and ruling one were two entirely different things. For these conquerors from the steppe, the complex bureaucracy and agrarian society of the Central Plains were like a celestial book written in an alien language. They only knew how to do one thing: plunder. Across every inch of Khitan-occupied territory, the atrocities of grass graining, their term for organized looting, sparked a furious Han resistance. Once submissive peasants picked up their hoes and kitchen knives, warlords who had surrendered began to waver. In just 3 months, the Central Plains became an erupting volcano. Yelu Deguang was terrified. He realized this piece of fat was too hot to swallow. He decided to retreat north with his immense stolen fortune. But fate had a black joke in store for the greedy emperor. On the way back, Yelu Deguang died suddenly of a violent illness. To prevent his body from rotting, the Khitans gutted him and packed his corpse with salt. And so, the once unrivaled father emperor returned to his grasslands in the form of what became known as an imperial jerky. The Khitans were gone. But the power vacuum they left behind triggered a new round of carnage. The short-lived later Han dynasty flashed across the sky like a meteor and disintegrated. And upon these ruins, a Han Chinese general named Guo Wei rose up and established the later Zhou dynasty. Guo Wei's father had been a provincial governor, but was killed by a warlord when Guo Wei was just a boy. Soon after, his mother died while fleeing the chaos. Guo Wei became an orphan, raised by his aunt. As a poor young soldier, he met a former palace lady, a woman named Chai. With a keen eye for talent, she insisted on marrying this destitute soldier, bringing with her a massive dowry. From there, Guo Wei rose through the ranks on the strength of his military achievements. But in a political purge, the emperor of the later Han ordered the execution of Guo Wei's entire family, who had been left behind in the capital. All of his sons were slaughtered. So when he finally put on the yellow imperial robe, he was an emperor who had the world, but had lost his entire family. And because of this, the spotlight of destiny fell upon an adopted son. His name was Chai Rong, the nephew of Guo Wei's wife, Lady Chai. In 954 AD, Chai Rong ascended the throne. Facing a shattered nation, he made a solemn vow. With 10 years, I will expand the realm. With 10 years, I will nurture the people. And with 10 years, I will bring about an age of great peace. He wasn't speaking empty words. Chai Rong was not just a military genius, he was a restorer of civilization. And here, we must mention the true origin of the Chinese name for where winds meet, Yanyun Shi Liu Sheng, the 16 sounds from Yanyun. Chai Rong's brilliant minister, Wang Pu, a master of astronomy and music, presented the emperor with a treatise. He argued that a chaotic age was, at its core, an age of chaotic sounds, or a disordered system. The traditional 12 tones were no longer sufficient. He creatively added 4 clear sounds, establishing the definitive musical scale of the realm as the 16 sounds. This wasn't just about music, it was a political manifesto. Chai Rong's mission was to use these 16 sounds to rebuild the very skeleton of the Chinese world, reforming the government, restoring the economy, and most importantly, forging a new army. He purged the imperial guard, executing generals who fled in battle, and promoted young, talented officers like Zhao Kuangyin. In just a few years, the later Zhou had created an iron army, the likes of which had not been seen in the 5 Dynasties period. This was no longer a warlord's private force, it was the nation's sword. And the sword was pointed directly at the place that was a source of heartbreak for all Han Chinese, the 16 prefectures of Yan and Yun. In the summer of 959 AD, Chai Rong made a stunning decision. He would lead a northern expedition in person. Though he had previously followed his minister's grand strategy of south first, north last, defeating rival states to the south, Chai Rong seemed to sense that his own time was running out. He did not want to leave this problem for the next generation. It was a true blitzkrieg. Unlike the slow, ponderous armies of the later Song dynasty, Chai Rong's forces advanced by both land and water, like a tiger devouring the world. Just 42 days. It was a miracle in the history of ancient warfare. Without a single major battle, the Zhou army recovered 3 prefectures and 3 key defensive passes. The Khitans were terrified to discover that the Han people to the south had changed. Their commanders surrendered without a fight. The once unbeatable Khitan emperor even considered abandoning Yuzhou, Beijing, and fleeing back. The morale of the Zhou army was at its absolute peak. Yuzhou was within their grasp. The breach in the Great Mountain defensive line was about to be sealed. The geopolitical nightmare that had plagued the Central Plains for decades was on the verge of ending. If history had frozen in that moment, the next 400 years of Chinese history might have been spared its greatest humiliations. But history has no if. On the eve of the final assault on Yuzhou, death arrived. The 39-year-old Chai Rong, at the very height of his power, suddenly fell gravely ill. Tian Bu Jianian, heaven did not grant him the years. These are some of the most heartbreaking words in Chinese history. Chai Rong was forced to return to his capital. A few months later, the greatest ruler of the 5 dynasties period died in Kaifeng, filled with infinite regret.
With his death, the gate to Yanyun, which had just been pushed open a crack, slammed shut again, and this time it would be locked tighter than ever before. Chai Rong left his successor a powerful, near-unified empire, an invincible army, and the unfinished dream of the 16 Sounds.
The world after Chai Rong's death did not become gentler because of his ideals. On the contrary, the power vacuum attracted even more wolves. On the throne in Kaifeng sat Chai Rong's 7-year-old son, and all around, countless greedy eyes were watching the orphan and the widow. The history of the 5 dynasties had taught everyone one brutal lesson. A child emperor and a doubtful court were a certain recipe for a coup. On the 3rd day of the new year, the Grand Army marched out, supposedly to defend against a Khitan invasion, which may have been a lie. When the troops reached a post just 20 kilometers from the capital, a meticulously planned drama unfolded. That night, it was said that many in the army were drunk. As the first rays of dawn touched the snow, the supreme commander of the Imperial Guard, Zhao Kuangyin, stepped out of his tent and found himself surrounded by his own generals, their swords drawn. A yellow robe, the symbol of the emperor, was draped over his shoulders. The moment it touched him, what was the look on Zhao Kuangyin's face? Surprise, resignation, or a fleeting glint of ambition? We will never know. All we know is that the entire army then knelt, and their shouts of "Long live the Emperor" shook the snow from the trees. This was the famous coup at Chen Bridge. Unlike the bloody usurpations of the past, Zhao Kuangyin displayed a high degree of political artistry. He made a pact with his generals. Do not harm the imperial family, do not loot the treasury, do not disturb the people. The army returned to Kaifeng without spilling a drop of blood. The 7-year-old emperor abdicated in a state of bewildered innocence. And so, the great Song dynasty was born. But this was not a happy ending. It was merely the start of a new gambling round. When Zhao Kuangyin finally sat on that throne and unrolled the map of the world, he would not have felt a shred of complacency. In the year 960 AD, he was not the only player on the board. This was an insane era where 6 emperors existed simultaneously in the land of China. To the north was the ultimate boss, the great Liao Empire of the Khitans. They occupied the 16 prefectures, a sword of Damocles hanging permanently over the new dynasty. In the northwest was the Northern Han, a remnant state that acted as the Khitans' loyal vassal and vanguard. In Sichuan was the later Shu, a rich and naturally fortified kingdom. In the south was the Southern Han, ruled by a psychopathic tyrant who decreed that all his high officials must be castrated. In the southwest was the Kingdom of Dali, and besides these 6 emperors, there were other powers. The most famous was the Southern Tang, a kingdom renowned for its flourishing economy and brilliant culture, but not for its backbone. 6 emperors and a handful of other warlords. There cannot be 2 suns in the sky, but the land of China was crowded with men who wanted to be the sun. Zhao Kuangyin had to make a choice, where to place the first piece on this chessboard. He continued the established policy of the later Zhou, south first, north last. It was a supremely rational decision. The north was a hard target. The Khitan cavalry was the best in the world, and they held the mountain passes. The northern Han had Liao backing. A prolonged war in the north could bankrupt the new Song dynasty. The south, on the other hand, was a juicy piece of meat. The southern kingdoms were rich but militarily weak. Conquering them first would not only be easy, but would also provide the most precious resource in this chaotic age: money. Easy first, hard later. Get rich first, get strong later. Zhao Kuangyin's calculation was shrewd. He would use the gold and silver of the south to feed the armies of the north. Once he had accumulated enough strength, he would turn back and fight a decisive battle with the Khitans to reclaim Yanyun. And so, the war machine of the Song began to rumble southwards. They conquered kingdom after kingdom. A prosperous, wealthy, and culturally brilliant new dynasty was rapidly taking shape. But history requires not just rationality. Sometimes it requires a hot-blooded charge. Zhao Kuangyin's rational decision gave his enemies the most precious gift of all: time.
While he was busy conquering the south, the situation in the north was undergoing a qualitative change. The Khitans used this priceless window of opportunity to completely assimilate the 16 prefectures. The Han Chinese people there, who had once longed for the Central Plains, grew disappointed, then numb, and finally became loyal subjects of the Liao. That great shield, which had once belonged to the Han civilization, had now grown into the body of the Liao Empire. 20 years later, when Zhao Kuangyin's younger brother, Emperor Taizong, finally turned his armies north, he was no longer facing a chaotic tribal confederation. He was facing a fully feudalized super empire with a powerful mobilization capacity. Was there any chance of success left?